Hi, folks. So some of you know me as an artificial intelligence researcher. The rest of you know me as the guy who teaches our undergrads how to make Skittle sorters. So I'm going to talk a little bit today. Yes. I mostly do artificial intelligence rather than sorting Skittles, and I would like to talk to you about non-Skittle research today. I do a bunch of things. What I'm going to talk to you about is my overarching pure research is basically in how we can teach computers to answer questions and do so in a way where they explain why they got the answers that they got, which is not a characteristic of machine learning right now. The really high level thing is that my long-term interest is in building artificial intelligence systems capable of answering natural language questions. So these are questions posed by text, while producing compelling human-readable explanations for their answers. The specific two problems that I work on are basically these ones here. How can we make machines reason with multiple facts? It sounds crazy, but the way that most models answer questions today is by basically looking up pre-made answers in enormous databases of text, Wikipedia, the Webb, or Google Books. Whereas if you need them to assemble an answer that isn't already pre-made, this is something that we basically can't do. And so that's one of the main things that I work on. And the other one is, how do we do this in a way that produces explanations for their answers? I have sort of a funny, non-traditional background. I'm part cognitive psychologist, part AI researcher. And so one of the tasks that I really love is tasks that model things like how babies do it or how kids do it. So I've sort of locked onto this task of trying to teach computers how to answer standardized elementary school exams as written. This was a task posed by Paul Allen of Microsoft fame for trying to significantly advance the science of artificial intelligence. I love this article from Wired that's a couple of years ago. We all heard about IBM's hype. You know, they have this system called Watson that was beating people on Jeopardy. They were going to take it to medical school. But then Paul Allen sort of came out and said, well, you can't really teach or take something to medical school when we can't even pass fourth grade science exams, right? Would you want to go to a doctor who can't pass elementary school? Probably not. So the best systems weren't even able to pass elementary science. So why are we going to medical school? This is actually a brand new slide because this just happened a couple of weeks ago. We actually can pass elementary science now, which doesn't ruin my story entirely. But a lot of us have been working on this for a while. This was in the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago. We can get more than 90% performance on these standardized science exams, which is really, really fantastic. The problem is that the whole idea that Paul Allen had with trying to give us this challenge task of passing these exams wasn't so that we could answer them. It was so that we could develop new methods that would explain the reasoning behind their answers. So we're basically using very complicated statistical models to answer the questions, but not to actually give the science explanations that we want. So there's a couple of big things here. The AI that we have right now, as of a couple of weeks ago, needs to read the equivalent of about 300,000 books. This is a significant fraction of what humans have written ever to do this. That's 160 gigabytes of just plain text, whereas most kids do this by reading a single book. And the other issue here is that we can't, or current methods really just can't explain the reasoning, and we really want to do that. I'm going to ground this task a little bit for you. Here's an elementary science question. Which of the following is an example of an organism eating a nutrient? Here's, it's a multiple choice test with the correct answer being a girl eating an apple. You might note here how the distractors, the incorrect examples, are all really good distractors. They all have an organism in them, a dog, a boy, an insect, and they all have something that's a high correlate of a food, like a tomato or a leaf. So basically, if you wanted to solve this with a current method, really rarely are you going to go out and look in Wikipedia and find an article with a sentence that says an example of an organism taking a nutrient is a girl eating an apple. This never happens, or it rarely happens. More often, what you need to do is you need to combine a bunch of facts. You need to know that a girl means a human girl, that humans are living organisms. This is really common sense or world knowledge that computers generally don't have. Eating is when an organism takes in nutrients in the form of food. You might find that in a study guide. then an apple is a kind of fruit and fruits are kinds of foods. And the work that I do basically works on developing methods that can try and connect all of these facts together, which turns out to be fantastically hard for a variety of different reasons. In general, the very best systems on planet Earth are able to combine maybe 2 or 3 facts, when my work has shown that we need to generally combine up to 16 facts just to answer and explain elementary science questions. So it's really in its infancy. I just have a minute or 2 left, so I'll show you a pretty picture. I work generally in 3 main areas. I work in trying to make data to solve the problem of explainable inference. So one of the reasons why we're not very good at making explanations right now is because machines use, and machine learning models use, training data, but we don't have any training data to train machines to make explanations. So I worked on making a large corpus or database of explanations. Here, each tiny little circle represents an explanation for an elementary science question. The links represent when they overlap facts. I showed you a toy example of a science question, so the girl eating an apple. Here's an actual example of one of the explanations from the database, which looks kind of scary. The question here is, which of the following characteristics best helps a tree survive the heat of a forest fire? The answer is thick bark. In order to do that, you need to know a whole bunch of things. You need to know that trees are living things, that fire causes harm to living things. Protecting means preventing harm. Bark is a protective covering around a tree. Thick things are more protective than thin things. And even that protecting something is something that you generally want to do. So more than just the core scientific concepts, you have a lot of nitty-gritty, deep stuff in there. So, and that's it. I stayed on time. Thanks.
I have several projects. Some of you know about some of the projects, but the newest one that started on October 1st, even though I wanted it to start next January, NSF decided it should start sooner, is an attempt to bring together genomics, environmental data to predict phenotype. Okay? And what does that mean? Well, you might know genomics, so your genes, and then you know the environment. And phenotype is the expression of a gene. So you might think, oh, I have this gene, so my eyes are blue, right? So that's sort of straight Mendelian, although eye color is not straight Mendelian, but that's the expression of the genes. But it turns out there's a lot of characteristics of expression of genes that are driven a lot by the environment or not driven by the environment. And the trouble is that we don't know what those are. So we know a lot about humans, we know a lot about some model organisms, and what the gene sequences are for those. But for most species on Earth, we don't know what's in them. So there was an initiative at the National Science Foundation called the Ideas Lab, a facilitated think tank thing. They brought a bunch of people, well, you applied to go to the think tank, you gave ideas for what should be in the think tank, they bring people together. And then for 2 days, you're all friends and you learn creative thinking techniques. And then for 3 days, you fight each other trying to form teams to come up with ideas that would not normally be presented to NSF from individual researchers. We used to come up with ideas that are sort of impossible and require interdisciplinary teams, but you have everybody there in the room, so you could try to steal people from other groups. And I need this expertise, so go steal them. So we did that and turned in a proposal, a pre-proposal. Our pre-proposal was selected. Then they asked us to do a full proposal. We did a full proposal. Then they accepted the full proposal, and now we have it. The only trouble is it's impossible. So what we want to do is predict what's going to happen to different species under different climate regimes as the environment changes. So there is environmental change driven by human action. That's what it is. So the kinds of examples and things that matter are crops. So how much wheat are we going to get this year? Well, that depends on what strains of wheat you planted, what the genetics are of the wheat you planted, and then what the weather is on top of that wheat. And if the weather is really bad, you get less wheat. If the weather is good, you get more wheat. But what's bad and good? And when does it matter that it rains or not rains? So in the crop world, there's a little bit of research and understanding, including some top-notch research here at U of A called TerraRef, where they set up gantries and robots and sensors and measured everything you can imagine for stretches of wheat and sorghum and other crops. And we have petascale data. That means a lot of data. And we have known genotype because they know what they planted. So it's a pretty controlled environment. So we're going to use that for modeling generative adversarial neural networks to do predictions of things like yield, die rate, maturation date, and a bunch of other characteristics of those crops. And what we want to be able, and with most of them have known genomics, or at least pretty well known genomics. And then in the second year, we'll start to generalize to other species, such as trees, so black cottonwood and others, that are normally in a broader environment, but we know a little bit about their genomics because of their economic significance. So black cottonwood, we happen to have the genes for that. We also have the National Forest Service that's been looking at which ones live and which ones die. We also have data sets from, well, you've probably heard in the news that there are forest fires. So why are there forest fires? Well, the forest fires are usually because the environmental envelope for a species has changed, and now the species no longer survives. Or it survives, but it's weakened to a state that it can be attacked by beetles or other things. And then that causes the tree to die. So in Colorado, 1 in 14 trees is now dead and standing up in the forest. And when and they tend to be clumped. So all those dead trees are fire hazard. So they catch fire and then terrible things happen. And after the fact, we could send firefighters. But what if we could predict 5 years in the future where the forest fires are going to be? Then we could go in and cut down the trees, maybe kill the bugs that are going to kill the trees, maybe plant different species of trees, all kinds of intervention before it's too late. So the object of this grant is to try to pull in data from the National Phenology Network. There's thousands of people who've been looking at when flowers bloom, when leaves burst, when the first ephemeral plants come out in the spring. That's been going on for about 60 years or so in this country and in other parts of the world. There's this guy called Thoreau that started keeping diaries of when things bloom. Anyone hear of Thoreau? David Thoreau? So there's long records of that. So we're going to try to exploit that data on a broader set of species and do things like infer what are the genes in that plant or in that animal from the behavior or the phenology. So predict backwards. And then we'll be able to tell the genomicist what to look for. So what primers should you put in the mix to analyze this species, because we predict that this biological pathway exists in this species, and that's why it's blooming at this time and not at that time. So as you might guess, we have biologists, we have ontologists. Oh, I didn't talk about ontologies. A lot of this is driven by biological ontologies, like the monarch ontology, which is written in a set of ontologies called OBO. And we can exploit those to look at known relationships between genotype and phenotype. So we have ontologists on the project, machine learning people on the project, biologists on the project, some physicists sort of people on the project, because we have to use data at different scales, data from sensors for things like GeoRef or TerraRef, where we have the sensors, LiDAR and other things right near the surface and measuring the plants. We have other cases where things are aerial-borne. NEON, the National Environmental Observatory Network, does flyovers with airplanes, so we have remote sensing, but at a higher altitude, lower resolution. And then we have a bunch of satellite data. We have hundreds of satellites going around the Earth, aiming down instead of aiming up. So we'll be using those different layers of data, different resolutions, and trying to integrate across scale. So we need physicists and other people to help us with that. So that's one project. This is a 2-year pilot project. It's a collaboration with Tufts University, Michigan State, Oregon State, and us. So it's just a couple $1 million, which doesn't go far, for 4 universities, to get a start with the hopes of creating an institute, which is around the scale of 20 million after. So this is priming money to take those ideas, and then we'll be fighting with those other groups again for who's going to get the money from these big ideas. So that's one project we're working on. So if you're interested in ontology, machine learning, genomics, phenotypes, phenology, which is timing in biology. Any of those things, let me know. There's a lot of people working on this project. Then I have some other projects that are running. One is in astronomy. So that's, instead of looking down, having the satellites looking down, we're looking at the satellites that look up instead. In that, we're using Cyverse. Actually, in the other project, we're using Cyverse as well, and the high-performance computing networks that it connects to. So in that project, we're trying to do data management. So if you're interested in data management for active data, so how can we process data within a stream of high-performance computing in such a way that the data is preserved long-term and easily accessible and reusable by other people? So those are the objectives. Right now, we're working with the James Webb Space Telescope. Anyone hear the James Webb Space Telescope? No. Okay. It's a big telescope, and it's going to go fly up and not take the place of Hubble because its mission is a little different. But deep space exploration, we're working with the infrared group right now. So building tools in cyber infrastructure to make it easier for the scientists to do their jobs. And we'll be putting in a new proposal for that for MSIP, which is medium scale astronomy project instrumentation grants. So if you're interested in learning how to write grants, we'll be writing grants. We already have money in grant round. Then I also work with bats. So looking at the phenology of bats. 1 minute. Lucky I didn't make slides. It would be longer. Phenology of bats. So when there's migratory bats, when do they come? When do they leave? When do they eat at night? Those sorts of things. I've been doing that for a while. So we're analyzing and trying to scale up. Putting out the instruments for doing that. So that's assembling boards and doing Internet of Things like things. But it's the Internet of Things in the wild and collecting data about species behavior. And then I'm in a project called Soundscapes. We're hiring a postdoc now. I just posted oh no, the job ad didn't go out. There is a job ad. It'll probably go out today or tomorrow. Looking for a postdoc. So if you're graduating with your PhD and looking for something to do in January, we have a postdoc working in sound analysis in environments. So looking in natural environments and urban environments using machine learning. I hear a beep. I'm done.
Thank you.
I'm going to talk about authors in the driver's seat. However, in order to explain that project, I have to say something about from scientific text to computable data. So that to explain why actually NSF want to fund that authors in the driver's seat project. It sounds really wild. Brian's talk already introduced you the concept of genomic data and the phenotype data. So phenotype data are observable traits of living organisms. Genomic data has been consistently and produced in high volumes using mechanisms. However, phenotype data often are produced by observation and human documentation. Those data are in publications, but they're not readily usable for computers. So they're information, but not data. So what we're trying to do is to get those phenotype data out of text. Our collaborators have been tracking the coverage of phenotypical data for living organisms, and their findings is like over 80% of the living organisms have less than 10% of phenotypical data recorded. That's why we need to mine the documents and find the data. Those are factual data, for example, leaf size, flowering time, those kind of information. So the first set of tools and machine learning and natural language processing systems that we produced was able to extract a lot of phenotypical data from different taxonomic groups. It is after we have this capability of extracting those facts, we realize that facts were not expressed in a factual way. They are very diverse and we don't actually have control vocabularies such as control ontologies to describe and define those terms. So we have the facts extracted, but they're not really computable data. By computable data, we mean that we can actually algorithmically compare the similarity between the data points. At this time, we extract information such as beak length 5 millimeters, beak length 6 millimeters. Are those measurements comparable? We don't actually know because how those measurements were taken were not clearly documented. You would have color, for example, rosy and pink. Are they the same? How different are they? We don't know. So from this, we reviewed more challenges, and we go up to create those controlled vocabularies, try to standardize those meanings, try to make hierarchical structures or other, through establish other relationships to create a way for the computers to measure the similarities. If you compare giving you a set of characters about this specimen versus another specimen, can we actually compute a similarity based on their observable characteristics? We did, after we actually used, we have not only us, but OBO, as Brian has mentioned, OBO Foundry has lots of ontologies has been created. For example, PATO is a quality ontology that's specifically designed to document color, shape, various phenotypical characters. With that, we conducted a number of studies. I'll just use one example to illustrate the issue here, which leads to the author in the driver's seat project. In that experiment, we create a machine that reads descriptions and convert descriptions into ontologized statements. So those statements basically using terms and relations from ontologies to construct a machine understandable character. And we have 3 postdoc researchers does the same thing based on their own knowledge. We did that in 2 rounds. In the first round, the postdocs only look at the descriptions of a phenotypical character. In the second round, they can actually look at, check references, check websites, and find knowledge resources. Our finding is that the machine was performing at probably 20% below human. However, most surprising finding is the humans, 3 postdoc researchers, their agreement among 3 of them are just at 60%. So 40% of times they actually can't agree what exactly being discussed in the description and how to best convert that into ontologized statements. So because of that, we look at this problem and we think I actually went in to check every errors and differences made between different curators. And we found that, first of all, the descriptions themselves are not that clearly written. Second of all, the ontologies are not complete. And when the ontologies are not complete and the user needs this term to describe this concept, they have to create something new. There is not a standard way for them to create such thing. So they could actually rely on their human creativity to actually create other things that create difference. Again, they are adding terms, but those terms are not standardized. So what we found really, the whole thing boiled down into, I think, one major issue is the author's intention when they described this was not documented. And the author, when they write their descriptions, they were not using control vocabulary. Actually, the fact is most of the authors are not even aware of ontology in biodiversity domains. That's why we, the machine versus human experiment has later an extension. We actually went and asked the authors. Oh, that's all. The time? Okay, 1 minute. So we actually went back and asked the authors whether those our human-generated statements match their original intention, and they most of the times don't. There are always some gaps. So this is why we actually proposed to NSF to saying that the major gap here is actually the authors, since the authors knows the domain, and ontology really is it's a conceptualization of its domain consensus. So when the authors write these descriptions, they are describing this world known to them. So the authors need to bring into this big picture of creating those ontologies, and they should be using those. So this project, we're second year into this project, we have developed a set of software prototypes. And so my major job right now is to understand what would motivate users to actually use those software applications. Can we make those software applications intuitive and help them to produce computable data at the time of publication so that they don't have to go through this human curation process again. Thank you, that's all. Thank you. Sorry for the...
You know, if a human sees a bunch of news texts, they can read through a whole bunch of news articles, find all the events, find all the times. They can make a beautiful database of all the events and locations and everything, produce a super pretty timeline. And what I would like to do is teach a computer to be able to do the same thing, right? So to be able to read normal human text, but produce all of the sort of databasey kind of stuff that you'd like to be able to actually search over. So here I've modeled that as an H function, right? That's what I'd like to learn. So how do we typically go about learning these things? We get humans to give us a bunch of examples. We call that annotation. So they walk through the text and they annotate the sort of semantic things we're interested in, events or times or whatever. We come up with some way of turning those texts into a whole bunch of numbers that we then feed into a machine learning model, typically these days a deep neural network of some sort. And that deep neural network learns that H function that's going to take the text to whatever semantic structure we're interested in. So I'll give two quick examples of this kind of research, two ongoing things. So one is learning to understand time expressions. So for example, that means taking an expression like Mondays and Fridays next January to the intervals on the timeline that that corresponds to, which is this set of Monday and Friday intervals in January of 2020, right? So how do we do that? Well, as I mentioned already, first we have a bunch of humans annotate what this looks like in the text. And in this case, that means annotating a pretty complex scheme of like this temporal operator, this word in English corresponds to this temporal operator to the machine. They're all linked together in this complex way. And we use all of that to then infer things. So this is the human annotating the formal semantics on the text. Then we train a machine learning model on those annotations. In this case, a deep neural network, as I sort of promised. In this case, you can see that it's reading the characters M-O-N-D, part of Monday, and recognizing at the top that it's a day of a week. And then we have a small set of rules that apply some constraints to figure out which Mondays go to which Fridays. For example, that there's an operator union that's going to apply to these Mondays and Fridays. So it's basically linking everything together. Once we have that, we have a temporal logic that we've implemented that simply applies the operators appropriately. So for example, if we take what was learned in this case, we first union together the all Mondays and all Fridays and get the union of those things, Mondays and Fridays. We ask for the January following now, which gives us the one in 2020. And then we simply intersect the two of those things to get those intervals we were looking at the beginning. All right, so a combination of annotation, machine learning, some rules, and some deterministic logic stuff that we put all together to do this. The one other example I'll give is understanding geographical expressions. So if I see a sentence like San Jose is the largest city in Northern California, presumably I want the San Jose in California, not the one in Costa Rica. In fact, San Jose is one of the most common names of places across the world. There are thousands of them. So literally, it's, you know, to us, it's an obvious situation. This San Jose is in California, particularly because I put California there. But in general, the computer has no idea how to decide which San Jose we're referring to. So what do? Again, we start by asking some humans to tell us exactly what the sentence means in a way that the computer can understand. So in this case, the human identifies each of the locations and gives it, in this case, the ID is the ID of a concept in the GeoNames ontology. So this is an ontology of a bunch of geographical locations. It has their latitude and longitude and polygons and stuff like that. The humans annotate that so we know exactly which San Jose was meant in this case. Then we're going to use that to learn. So again, we apply a deep neural network, which in this case basically just recognizes where the locations are. So this is sort of similar to the time operators. Here it recognizes that San Jose is a location, a lock up there, and is not part of the location expression. So that's finding the locations. Then we need to match the location name, San Jose, up to the ontology, right? So in this case, we basically have a machine learning-based re-ranker that looks at a bunch of different things that are available, including things like the location, the country that it's in, the population is a pretty good cue. If you know nothing else, you should pick the biggest one. And it takes all of the things that have been retrieved for San Jose. I've only shown 3 here. There's about 1,600, I think. And it re-ranks them to put the most probable one, given what we're currently at the top. In this case, because I made the slide, it's done the right thing, and it's put the San Jose from the United States at the top. So that's basically 2 interesting problems that we work on now. I want to give just a couple seconds to talk about some interesting open challenges. So there are a bunch of time expressions that are not as easy as the one that I showed, things like 3 weeks post-op, which you can't interpret unless you know what op refers to, right? What operation is it referring to? And until you figure out the time of that operation, you don't know where the 3 weeks are. Flu season, when is flu season? Right now. Here, it's other times in other places. And harvest season is even worse because not only is it other times in other places, it's other times in other places for other crops, right? So all of these things have a meaning, right? They're little intervals on the timeline, but you've got to figure out where and when, and it depends on all kinds of cool, crazy factors. One ongoing thing we just sort of started with geographic name normalization is, let's say you didn't know where Wenatchee National Forest is. I don't. But you did know some of these other things, and you've got a sentence describing it, that it's along the eastern slopes of the Cascade Range from Okanogan National Forest to Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. Could you, from those other pieces, decide, okay, well, you know, it's sort of somewhere in that green box that I've highlighted there, which is the space in between those 2 other forests that have been mentioned and on the eastern slope of this range, right? So this is sort of the same kind of compositional thing that we do for times, but for locations. And that's it. Thank you for listening.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laila. I'm going to talk about our efforts in blurring the boundary between the real and the virtual worlds for improved user experience. Why do we want to do such a thing first? So the first project that has just finished and we are now working on the publication is on dynamic tangible user interfaces in VR for increased user experience, improved user experience, and hopefully increased presence, which is not always the case. We hope for increased presence and improved user experience in these studies, but sometimes things may not go as planned. But still, it's valuable to try. So in this project, the goal was to incorporate embodied tangible interaction, which means interacting through tangible objects that are familiar in form from the real world so that the users have an easier time. The interaction becomes more intuitive for them, and their sense of presence, which can be described as the feeling of being there, really being transported to a virtual world, increases. So in this project, we incorporated dynamic tangible objects into the core experience in VR to isolate the effects of the tangible dynamic interaction. And the overall aim was to make interaction more natural, intuitive, and making the system disappear a bit more, becoming more seamless so that it's no more a distraction for the user, but the user kind of more naturally interacts with it. Okay, so in this one, it was mainly a soccer game in VR. We can call it VR soccer game. So the tangible familiar object was a soccer ball, which we constructed using trackers and some 3D printed components and a casing spherical shell. But it had to be transparent because we needed to collect infrared lights from the lighthouses still. And then the user's goal was to shoot the ball with feet and then just shoot once and then wait for it to rest at a target. So that's the user's view inside the headset. We had foot markers, we had lighthouses inside the room, and we had a tangible ball that we constructed. And the hypothesis is that tangible ball would improve user experience in VR. And we had a non-slippery pad for the tangible ball to rest, because it was a bit hard at first for the users to make it rest at in-house testing. And then the users wore HTC Vive VR headsets so that they only viewed the virtual world inside the headset, and they weren't able to see their real-world surroundings. And that's a very short video from our tangible mode. The user plays with the ball by just how they would play with a ball in the real world. And then we had a virtual version for for control, where they shot a virtual ball. Again, similarly, but they just used like foot movements. There were nothing tangible. So we had a between subjects user study with 40 individuals, 20 each. And then scores were better in tangible overall. Those are their starting and rest positions with the balls, mostly similar, but tangible was a bit more accurate in terms of scoring. Presence, as I said in the beginning, we didn't catch much difference. So their overall presence score, which you can see here, were, so 7 is the highest, 1 is the lowest. They were both above average, but not much difference in between two versions. In terms of cyber sickness, again, tangible was a bit better, but not significant. Users tended to like the tangibility in the interaction. Interesting observations, they got really competitive, even though we told them it doesn't matter, even if they miss the target or we are not looking for the highest score. And they made audible comments about feeling bad, like I'm so bad at this when they scored low. And second interesting observation, they tended to cheat. We observed it in more than like a lot of users. So they were supposed to shoot once and then wait, like how it was in the videos. But some tended to shoot like twice. Some tended to roll the ball continuously until they were like on the target. Some even like ran and stopped the ball at the center of the target by force. So that was interesting for us to observe in a behavioral perspective. Okay, the second project that was granted and currently like setting up ongoing is about incorporating bidirectional tangible embodied interaction in VR. So the goal is to induce illusory physicality of a virtual human. So that how do we make human users perceive virtual human as more real, more physical? So we explore this through a mutual interaction towards a shared goal. For this, we have custom designed tangibles. This is the projection screen that divides it, and we have a hole here. And then we have custom designed tangibles like the steering wheel here. This is our human user. And then this is our tangible steering controller. We have a curtain, that's our projection curtain. And we have a hole on the curtain. The rest, the other half is at the back. But what we can achieve by this is we can automatically rotate the steering wheel and then give the user the illusion that the virtual character is actually making an effect in the physical world by rotating that steering wheel. So that's our virtual character, that's our physical steering wheel. We have a virtual rendering. We have the actual second half in the back. Remember, we had the hole in the curtain, but we also have a matching virtual rendering so that the human user observes a virtual rendering, which enables the virtual character to rotate it and make an effect in the user's environment. And those were our fancy design sketches that we aim. That's our ugly-looking current prototype, but it always starts like that. So we are on track. So that's our tangible steering wheel that we try to rotate in both ways. And then we are going to put a curtain and divide it in half. So that's about it. Thanks for listening.
See, I'm interested in making the perfect library. And I think it can be done right now. The technology is there. Now the details are sort of on the first page, so I'm just going to jump straight into the second page. So a question that's interested me with all these technologies, so these are the things that can be done now, is how to fit them together. So this is not really a research question in the sense of advancing knowledge. Rather, it is a practical question with stunning benefits to societies and the world at large. In avoiding harms, the solution to it defeats 1984, the rewriting of documents such as contracts, laws, and news. It defeats fake photos, fake videos, deepfake videos, etc. In providing benefits, it gives you the perfect library. Where is something small that I could do in this arena? A component in here is contracts, often so-called smart contracts. These are computer programs that will run usually deterministically and inexorably to a conclusion that enforces the contracts. The problem is that the programmers have not been very good at writing them. Surprisingly, more than a few times, the programmers have not had a good handle on the logic and the content of their contracts. The Ethereum DAO, Digital Autonomous Organization fiasco, is an example. Basically, $70 million was stolen and the whole wonderful project folded. And I quote from someone else, had the code been written correctly, the hack could have been avoided. Then this Wednesday, there's another thing, another popular app on Ethereum has folded due to bad programming. Now, the programmers writing the code and the contracts are usually very talented, much more talented than I would say. But yet more than enough times they've gone wrong. I think the issue here lies with the systems and programming languages that they use. There is a better way. Use functional programming and the best verification methods. Now, I imagine that half the people in this room know what functional programming is. The other half don't. So just for the other half, I will say, functional programming is a fancy type of programming that people in universities love. There we go. So let me turn to something entirely differently. End user programs the millions of users will have are going to have to run out of web browsers, run on smartphones, tablets, etc. This means that the actual running object code has to be JavaScript because it's installed universally. Unfortunately, JavaScript is no good. Executive summary, it's impossible to write a, say, 30,000 line program directly in JavaScript and have any hope of it running properly. With JavaScript, you have to write the program in some other framework or system and then cross-compile it or transpile it into the running code, into the running JavaScript. So essentially, you're treating JavaScript as an assembly language. Then the question arises, what should the source framework or system be? So here comes a bias, like the baby alien jumping out of my chest. It needs to be a functional programming system. And actually, the presently available resources here are very limited. Then the best functioning programming ecosystem we have is Haskell. However, to date, Haskell and JavaScript or JavaScript web pages barely know each other. So now I have two definite problems to take on. Devise ways to write smart contracts and devise ways to write end-user software for the library of the future in Haskell. That's what I'm doing. So let me show you a toy example. If we can pull up a web browser, and if we get a web browser. Let me show you a toy example. Before I do so, I'd like to turn to modern art and the phrase, my 5-year-old could have painted that. The software I'm going to show you could have been written, I would say, by a good computer science honors undergraduate. However, the trick lies in thinking or realizing that this is a piece of software that needs to be written. That's kind of my contribution, that's what I'm doing. So up the top here, it's gone from sight now, but what it is a Wysiwyg Editor. I can't scroll down again, but never mind. It's a Wysiwyg Editor. What's down the bottom here is a spreadsheet, and what you'll see normally is just a couple of columns and 50 rows. So it's not very big, but there's two of them. But what connects the two of them is Haskell, right? So Haskell is parsing the expressions and then doing the reductions for you and then giving you it back. Now the whole panel is JavaScript. So the whole thing's running in JavaScript. Moreover, it's what's called a functional reactive program, which means it's a very fancy way of doing a program for the web. So this isn't anything directly to do with the library of the future, but I believe if I have the capability of producing this, I can write the stuff. Writing the stuff's easy now. So thank you.
Hello, I'm Catherine Brooks. Today I wanted to talk about just one project, but generally, for those of you who don't know me, I study human behavior. I'm more on the social science side of things, and I tend to focus on language and discourse in a lot of my work, and this work included. So I study how language shapes reality and how language impacts relationships, and it makes it interesting in my job because when I'm sitting in meetings, sometimes I'd rather approach the meeting as a researcher and look at behavior, but I try not to. So this project is tied to the deep fake problem. Some of you are aware of that problem. Some of you aren't. Generally, I'm interested in misinformation, fake news, and how humans are behaving in this environment where we can slop around fake images and silly memes, but also, I think I read the other night, there have been now 70 democratic processes that were disrupted by fake bots coming out of certain countries trying to disrupt democratic processes. And so these kinds of questions keep emerging. The deepfake problem is related to that in this broader landscape of misinformation. So deepfakes, for those of you who don't know, in late 2018, there was a Reddit author who his name was actually Deepfake. And he called himself that because of the work he was doing on fake videos. And so what you can do these days, you can actually make a fake video with an app in a couple of hours. Closer to the mic over here. How about that? You can, I won't go into the details, but you can bring around, say, 100 pictures of someone pulled from the internet, and train a deep learning model and end up with a very realistic looking video. We used to see this kind of thing in movies, in Star Wars and things like that. When we watched the recent Star Wars movie, we knew reality wise that Princess Leia was no longer with us on this planet, and yet there she was in the movie. And so, these things, have been going on for a long time. The problem is, now we're at the intersection of anyone can do this sort of thing with an app on their phone. And when we tie that with the rapid pace of information movement on things like social media, that's kind of where this problem resides. The internet's been great, right? In social media, it enhances our ability to interact interpersonally with our friends and stay connected. But we also know there's a dark side to social media behavior. So sometimes false information actually, there's research that shows that false information moves much quicker than truth. And so we have some research that's sort of scary in terms of how people behave with fake news. And it truly will have heavy implications. And so the deep fake problem happened sort of in late 2018. And what it was is, someone would mine pictures of famous people and impose them onto porn star bodies. And so famous actors and actresses became alarmed and called this an intrusion to their privacy. At the same time, the artists claimed that it was their free expression and artistic right to do whatever they wanted with online free content. And so legally, we're still in this weird tension. The tension is not just about law, however. Who's on the right side of the law? The artists with their expression, or people with their personal rights and their lives. And so we're not out of the woods. The main question I have is how we frame the problem will impact the solutions that we bring about to solve the problem. Here's an analogy. Sometimes when we talk about shootings in elementary schools, if we frame that problem as a mental health, public health kind of problem, the way we resolve it will be very different than if we situate that problem as a criminal problem with the need for more policing and arming our teachers and so forth. So that's an example where we can see solutions are really driven by the way we frame the problem in the first place. So one study I did was in the spring of 2019. Then I mined all the public articles I could find in lots of different magazines, anything about the deepfake problem, to figure out how it was framed discursively. If it's framed as an ethical problem, the solutions we will be asking for are more tied to policy and law. If the solution is something, if the issue is framed as a technical one instead of an ethical one, then we'll be asking people in the tech sector to continue developing tools for digital forensics and things of that nature. So again, my focus for this particular research project was on how we frame the problem. I think I'm just sort of skipping. I kind of said all this. Anyway, fake news is a problem. So if you didn't know that, let me tell you, we're kind of in a weird period. Okay, so there are heavy implications. Again, I've pointed to some of them. There are big risks to democracy. So there are countries trying to tear down other countries' elections and other democratic processes. If we think about culture, video culture is real. We're in a video culture where we believe what we see. Dash cams, nanny cams. I actually learned in some of this research that there are foot cams. So there are upskirt pictures from cameras on people's shoes. And so we're in this sort of odd camera situation. It intersects with the ability of the mobile phone to take a fabulous photo. I'll hurry. I hear that. I hear it. But also there are also concerns about individual privacy, bullying in school, fake romantic affairs, taking down someone tied to their job, ruining their career. It could be done in just a few hours on a phone. And once it sort of passes and goes viral, it's very hard to undo it and get it back. Anyway, my discourse analysis brought about some findings, mainly doom and gloom. Someone referred to it as postmodern hell. Also the concerns about bullying in schools, the damage to individuals, also reference to a global war zone. And those were very, very serious, and certainly concerns about the financial sector. So I'll tie up, which is if we believe nothing, we lose everything. So we are, in terms of our kind of social psychology or our for global humanity, we're in a bit of a bind. I want to leave you with something positive, though, and that is that there are people that are trying to solve this problem. There are people that are working on new tools. One thing I did last summer is I wrote a small piece in Wired magazine. And when you write for Wired magazine, you are forced to have a Twitter handle, which I do now. And I don't tweet. I try. It takes me a really long time. And there were people that responded via Twitter to say, that's what our company, we're working on fake photos. So there was a conversation about some of the solutions, it was actually Twitter that gave me access to some of these groups that are working on the ground with new technologies, new areas in journalism. There are a new area called Journalistic Forensic, but it sounds like crime in journalism anyway. So new areas. Generally, my work will hope to continue to explore, these issues so we can continue to ask for the right solutions to solve the problem for the good of humanity. Yes. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. My name is Bosley, and my current research interests mainly human-computer interaction in XR, which includes virtual reality and mixed reality, and more specifically the unique interaction techniques. And my focus are the object manipulation, which includes object position change and the rotation change, and the locomotion, which is actually changing your own place in a virtual environment. So one of the recent projects we have is called Spartan. It is a spatial augmented reality with tangible interactions. In that we have examined 3 different interaction methods. One of them was simple controller interaction to manipulate the position and the rotation of the objects, virtual objects. And the other one was, again, quite common, is a hand gesture interaction method in which you use hand gestures in order to move objects and rotate the objects in virtual environments. And what we wanted to compare them with was the tangible embodied interaction that includes only the rigid body that you are supposed to move or rotate. So in order to achieve that, we have created a custom-made tangible cube. And inside that cube, we put the controller for the magnetic tracking option of that controller. We also utilized the image tracking, and we put some weird images on top of the cube so that we can clearly track the cube in the real environment. And we actually combined these two techniques because both of them has some good and bad properties. So we combined them to get a better results. So at the end, we have compared these three different techniques for both object translation and rotation. And we had a user study with 42 participants within subjects study. And basically, if we go over the views, the user's view inside the see-through headset is something like that. So you can see the view of the real cube underneath the digital content. So we are mapping, we are trying to map the digital content to the real tangible object as much as we can, so that when the user holds the cube, it can see the digital content that is attached to the real cube as well. So we were also able to add more information to that real cube, like and the colors you can see on top. So the idea is to put the cube onto the marked area, but the top face of the cube should match the color of the top face should match to the color of the circle. So some rotation and translation was involved. And this is again the user's view for the gesture interaction. So in the gesture interaction, for the translation, you have to grab the cube with your gesture from the center. And if you grab the cube from the edges, you can make the rotation operation within. So we have looked the learning time, completion time, various usability metrics for these three options, cyber sickness metrics as well, preference and accuracy. The results, we also looked for the performance of them as well. So for the performance and for the preferences, we have seen some significant differences, and this is the graph of the centers of the digital content, and these are the target points. So we have realized that for the tangible embodied system, people are getting a little lazy, maybe because they are really carrying the cube's weight, so they are putting them a little closer to themselves. So it is much more realistic in terms of the weight perception of the cube. And another project that is ongoing is the Googly Eyes. So it is basically displaying users' eyes on an HMD inside us. So we are basically getting the eye tracking data from the headset, and we are putting them onto the headset so that we can have the sense of more presence. So we are looking for, can we decrease the degree of isolation in VR, and can we increase the social communication between HMD and non-HMD users? And we use cartoonish rendering to avoid some uncanny images like this. So the implementation of the evaluation application is ongoing. So we are trying to create a VR application that includes two-way communication and collaboration for achieving a shared goal with HMD and non-HMD users. And for a few seconds, I'm going to talk about my upcoming research. So I was focusing on point and teleport locomotion technique, which is basically users point where they want to go in the virtual world, and they are teleported to that position. And we are tending to look at how to improve point and teleport locomotion for complex scenarios and environments in VR. One scenario is that point and teleport with real-time predictive obstacle avoidance cues. Since the teleportation usually occurs instantaneously, we cannot perceive the time that is going to pass between the teleportation. So we are trying to show what will happen when you teleported to that position. And the next one is point and teleport for multi-floor occluded spaces. So if you want to get teleported to the upstairs or downstairs, you can use that technique as well with this improvement. And finally, three-dimensional locomotion with point and teleport, so that if you are moving in a three-dimensional space, if you can still use the point and teleport technique for these applications. So that's it.
So some of you probably recognize this quotation from my title. It's from Greta Thunberg's UN talk that she gave a couple of weeks ago. And I think it's really a nice representation of climate science and climate change deniers. And it harkens back to a book that came out 30 years before Thunberg was born, called The Limits to Growth. This book was published in 1972, and it's been translated into about, 24 different languages. It was distributed worldwide. A lot of different publishers in a lot of different countries published it. The research team was based at MIT in the Sloan School of Management. These are the 4 members who were at MIT. There were also some international researchers. The person who's to the right, second from the right, is Jay Forrester. And some of you who know your computing history probably recognize that name. He was instrumental in, he worked on the Navy's Whirlwind computer. He was instrumental in the change from vacuum tubes to magnetic tape for data storage. And he was also a pioneer in systems dynamics, so systems thinking, looking at, in his case, corporation and a city as systems, and thinking about how a change in one aspect will change the whole system. So this research group was inspired by his work to look at the whole planet as a system. And they used computers at MIT, they created models, they used data from different countries, they tried different inputs, they ran different series, and they came up with various projections based on different kinds of data. And their real blockbuster projection appears on page 23. You've probably all just read it. And basically, their projection showed that if we continued on the current path with unlimited growth, that within 100 years of the publication of the book in the early 70s, we would have most likely collapse. So here we are, halfway there, or more perhaps. But as you can imagine, this caused a huge sensation. And this is, I'm not sure how well you can see that, but this is from Web of Science, just to give you a sense of the citation pattern. This is strictly for the 1972 edition of The Limits to Growth. There were many other subsequent editions and updates. So just for the 72, more than 3,700 citations. And you can see, I hope, that economics and environmental sciences are the 2 biggest disciplines citing back to limits to growth. So as you all know from thinking about citations, your own and others, citing a work doesn't necessarily mean you agree with it or support it. So some of these, particularly in economics, are attempts to completely discount, or we might say deny, the need to limit growth. Others are by scholars who saw the potential but critiqued the models, critiqued the assumptions, and tried to build their own models. And if you look at the Google Ngram, limits to growth with a capital L and a capital G, and how often that phrase appears in books that are indexed by Google, you can see that there's a big peak within a couple of years after the 1972 edition, and it levels off, but it never completely goes away. If we did an engram for just the phrase limits to growth, we'd see a lot of occurrences of that phrase, even when the book itself is not cited, even when the author hasn't read the book or ever heard of it. So somehow that phrase has entered our consciousness. So I'm working at this little intersection between book history and environmental history. And there are a couple of examples that I'm trying to use. The first is a now classic work by Priscilla Murphy on Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And one of the most important pieces for me of that book is the documentation that people are influenced by a book, they'll talk about a book, and they'll take action based on a book that they've never read. Okay, so you don't have to read it to be influenced by it or to act like you know what's in it. And the other one is Andy Kirk's study of, or use of, Stuart Brand's Whole Earth Catalog to understand the environmental movement as part of a larger counterculture of the 60s and 70s. So I think working at that intersection gives me an opportunity to think about the intellectual connection between Thunberg and two of the original Limits to Growth scholars, Dennis Meadows and Jorgen Randers, who are still talking about and still updating the research and so on. So thinking about their intellectual connection, that lineage, but also thinking about the book and how it plays a role in the production and reception of scientific communication.
Today, I'd like to share with you work that I've done on holodecks, cyber learning, and health science design. So my background's in human-computer interaction and learning sciences, and I apply this to education and health. So if we go back, my first job was curriculum development. My thesis was on an individual working with a learning companion, so peer tutoring situation. We've done a lot of work since then on intelligent tutoring systems online that would help people prepare for SATs or learn basic math questions. But starting with that, I wanted to broaden it out and get into more immersive environments and more collaborative environments. So eventually, given the nature of this speed talk, came up with the concept of a holodeck. And so the holodeck was kind of a next generation. The title of the grant was an Experiential Supercomputer, a transdisciplinary holodeck for innovation, research, and education. So the idea was that many people around in the area of advanced computing and human-computer interaction have created one-off instantiations of these devices. My thesis, for example, with an affective learning companion, used multimodal sensing and a character to create a social interaction. Places like the Olisphere at Santa Barbara are large instruments, largely dedicated. It's kind of like a planetarium, but not only above you, below you, and very immersive sound. So, but it doesn't have those physiology elements, and it doesn't have the peer companion that my system had. So the vision of the holodeck was, could we fuse some of the existing and emerging technologies across many of these different domains and create a next generation platform that could be reconfigured for researchers to do different work. This is common with advanced microscopes or advanced telescopes. You have a large array of disciplines using those or subdisciplines, and they configure them, whether you want projection on the walls or projection in your head-mounted display, or whether you want the presence of a social robot or not. So this depiction here has a number of different elements. It has a biochemist trying to sequence or create a designer DNA, has a music technologist using the DNA as a xylophone and exploring the sonic properties, has a social robot collaborating with one or the other of them, has a potential 3D printer at the top printing out the structure. So this is sort of a vision of how you fuse the multiple elements. And then just going across elements of my career, I was at Arizona State where they have the Decision Theater. There's a picture of Decision Theater. And we had used this environment for astronaut robot mission simulator environments. So having a robot or an astronaut in the Mars yard at JPL or on a treadmill at MIT, if the terrain goes up, the physiology of that astronaut would, the respiration and the heart rate and everything would go up. And we'd see all that in the Decision Theater and be able to decide, should they climb the hill to pick up the rock, or should they go down into the valley? Should the robot do that, or should a human? Again, distributed collaborative. So again, multiple ways of doing visual, and this is a sound studio at NYU. I came over from NYU. It was 5 years there in the College of Nursing. That'll come up in a moment. But basically using the existing and emerging technologies. So the visual, the audio, the physical. So looking at how do you print sorry, too many buttons. All right. Well, given the nature of the talk, I'll stay here and not go back and forth. But so the physical says, can we print or fabricate things and make those possible for teams of designers or design engineers? Can we measure the skeletal properties of an individual? So are they doing jumping jacks? Are they, for a lymphedemic recovery, doing a stretch that's an appropriate stretch that really stretches the areas that need to and benefit them. So these are, and part of the idea of an instrument is, in the instrument, you can do some of the high-end work, but then can you build low-cost devices, maybe with a smartphone? Can you capture and train the smartphone to detect that perfect stretch? So now you have an app at home that can help you with oncological lymphedemic recovery. Can this all be tied into our supercomputing structures? So working very closely with university infrastructure of high performance computing and UITS and analogies at other universities, can we create a pathway to do things like concert on a holodeck, where you have different performers in different places working together and performing either in dance or music? How does the audience experience that? Does the audience experience, say, high resolution visuals at the stage level, or do they take out their phones and their phones detect things in that display that the researchers have put in there, and so they can see a augmented character participating in the dance? Or maybe they get to participate in the dance and the people in the performance get to see things coming from the audience. So we're really looking at building a interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary instrument that can be reconfigured in multiple ways for these diverse purposes. And this is one of the areas that we've been focusing on in nursing and interprofessional health, which is in teams of individuals. When you can start to work with humanoid robots and look at the physiology of different people and their learning, their cognitive load, can you go beyond areas of competency, which is what we hopefully train people to do right now, and get into addressing conflict or creativity or leadership? So leadership might be, if you have an individual that doesn't know enough, maybe you're able to step out of your role and teach them, or maybe marginalize them appropriately for the safety and well-being of the patient, right? So there's different strategies at that point. So we've covered a lot in holodecks and some in cyber learning. Another area of cyber learning that we've done is the notion of having a peer companion, like I did in my thesis, but having it be a robotic social agent. So this robot helps kids in middle school learn about the Cartesian coordinate system and plot the area of a square or rectangle or circle. And we're expanding this using the holodeck to look at how do we look at the interpersonal connections between the humans, 2 or 3 children, and the robot, and one another, either in a co-located place or in a distributed place. If you have a person, for example, I'm working on a collaboration right now looking at a person who, pediatric oncology, they can't participate in their everyday classroom, but could they virtually, potentially, through informal science and informal learning, either control the robot or participate with their colleagues in some of the learning remotely? So the big vision, learning anywhere, anytime, whatever you want, and passion-based learning. So doing things either in the Cartesian coordinate system or in an environment like exploring Mars or the oceans or other areas, or your city, thinking about what are the practical aspects of the city that your environment that you're exploring. And then both in nursing and throughout my career, but here as well, we're starting a health science design program. And so I have a joint appointment in health sciences. And this image is of a project that came out of a course that we taught at the MIT Media Lab, which was Design That Matters, and looking at how to not only do corporate inspired design, but to partner with individuals around the world, and came up with the concept of an infant incubator built out of car parts. And so this one, Times Magazine Award of the Year, and the nonprofit that came out of this, the Design That Matters group, took that concept and evolved it into a jaundice therapy device. So here you see one of their Firefly Bassinets. Some unique features: it has light coming from the top and bottom. It's small enough only to hold one baby. What happens a lot in places that don't have this device is they crowd the light. So they have 10 or 15 babies that need light therapy, but none of them get enough because they're crowding. So the bottom up is another feature that gives more light than you would have just from the top. And sometimes people inappropriately wrap the child so their skin isn't getting some of the content. So looking at how to do diverse design in unique settings. Another area that has overlap with health is a portable decompression chamber for advanced scuba diving. So both to extend the range and deploy this anywhere in the world, but also for recovery. So too often you might have the bends, you aren't in an area where you can get into a recompression chamber. Having a device like this would allow you to go back into the water in a small capsule that you could get therapy for.
All right. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for organizing it. This is always an exciting time to be able to share work and also get to know what everyone's up to, because we see each other in the hall and it's like, oh, what are you doing now? So I'm Jamie Lee, and I am talking today about producing the archival body, which in a way is kind of like a phrase of encapsulating like all of my work. So I'm going to start with this particular excerpt from an oral history, and then I'll talk a little bit about that. So here we go.
All my relatives would rather propagandize or say to whatever that I don't exist, or that my life never happened, or I was one they don't want to talk about. And I want it archived that I lived, and that my life counts, that I'm here, and that I'm a brave person, and that the truth, I want the truth to be documented because it's important. I was born intersexed. I'm 62 years old, and I want people, students and medical people and social workers and other people in the LGBTQI community to always have access to look at this film, to learn from it, to take whatever good they can from it, not only for themselves personally, but to pass on to other people. So that it's not lost.
So this is an excerpt that I collected. It's an oral history, and it resides in the Arizona Queer Archives. And I use it to talk about the power of the archive and how Jay is positioning it in a way to understand himself and the ways to legitimate his own life, because so often he's been marginalized. So I'm interested in looking at archival studies, archival practice and theory, and looking at bodies and our identity, subjectivity, connecting like affect phenomenology and how we understand how those two come together, and looking at the power there. And so using storytelling to kind of move through this sort of inquiry. And so I have just put some key concepts here, the definitions of archives. You can see we can think of it as a location, practice, and in humanities, we also hear people talking and writing about the archive. So we start to see that we have some differences around how we understand it. What is archival is a good question to also think about. And again, bodies, we can think about, the flesh, but then also this locus of identity and social structure, and this link that we have with our surroundings, how we understand place, our families. There's a lot of connections as we see the ways we're interrelated. And then also thinking about embodiment as an ongoing process. And then what does that over time, what does that have to do with archives, and how might it change how we understand archival theory and practice? And I use queer theory and as a way to misrecognize, critique, and also challenge stable categories. And so when we think about like a lot of the standards, maybe Dublin Core standards, Library of Congress subject headings, we can start to see how, if we're working with community archives, how could we look at standards that, you know, maybe a little bit more malleable to look at the ways they're interrelated. We can think through relational sorts of naming practices. And if some of you have been reading like Gloria Anzodua's work, she just had her birthday, you know, she's been dead for a while, but I'm always thinking about her and her idea that when we mark something, it's a way of marking down. So if we're doing that in naming, then how do we see the role that naming and identifying people, and if we're not part of certain like communities, how does that mark them down and create more hierarchy? I'm also interested in thinking about multiply situated and all the different hats we wear, the different communities we're a part of. So then how can we understand metadata and description as working to be more relational? And then here are just some of the projects that I'm working on right now. A 3-year research project called Community-Based Archives, Considering the Power of Naming Practices. And I'm working with 2 Knowledge River students, Kristen Swiggy-Booty and Samantha Montes. And then I'm working on a single authored monograph right now that will come out later next year with Rutledge and their new Studies in Archives series, and looking at the ways that archives and bodies continually shape each other, and looking through human subjectivity as what I had described a little bit earlier. And I'm also a co-PI in the Climate Alliance Mapping Project, where we're taking data on energy infrastructures through the Americas and creating digital storytelling from those locations. And I run the digital storytelling oral history lab and bringing together grad students, faculty, and community members to talk about storytelling, and also work through like hands-on expertise and skills in, you know, not only knowing the technology, but what questions do we ask and how can it then be used in community? And a lot of it is around social good and decolonizing methodologies. And the last thing, I'm a faculty fellow at the Howry Program for the Environment and Social Justice, and I'm working on finishing a documentary film project called Agua Miel, Secrets of the Agave, and it's looking at what's happening along the U.S.-Mexico border in terms of communities and individuals kind of enacting certain practices in their everyday that are pushing back against climate change. And so really excited about that. And hopefully next year when we're doing this Blitz, I'll have some video to show you for that. And that, I'm going to end just with this quote. I'm really interested in time and how we move through time as dynamic and multiply situated beings. And this is a quote from Sheila Membe, a post-colonial theorist. The present is precisely the moment when different forms of absence becomes mixed together. And then absence of those presences that are no longer so, and one remembers, is the past. And the absence of those others that are yet to come and are anticipated, the future. And so I just wanted to leave that with you. Just a nice quote to think about how we understand ourselves through time. So thank you so much.